Did Nick Carraway and Chester McKee have sex at the end of chapter 2 of The Great Gatsby? That's the question that concerns us today. So let's look at the evidence and see if we can possibly come up with some idea. So, sexual ambiguity in The Great Gatsby, chapter 2. The first passage that we're going to begin with is a pretty well-known one, which is the Valley of the Ashes. And I've titled this slide, the Anhedonic Valley of the Ashes. Anhedonia means a lack of pleasure. And so we have the opening paragraph with many things that I've bolded and put in red, marking the rather sepulchral nature of this space, the space around kind of death and lack of pleasure. About halfway between West Egg and New York, the motor road hastily joins the railroad and runs beside it for a quarter of a mile, so as to shrink away from a certain desolate area of land. This is a valley of ashes, a fantastic farm where ashes grow like wheat into ridges and hills, and grotesque gardens where ashes take the forms of houses and chimneys and rising smoke, and finally, with a transcendent effort of men who move dimly and already crumbling through the powdery air. Occasionally, a line of gray cars crawls along an invisible track, gives out a ghastly creak, and comes to rest. And immediately the ash-gray men swarm up with leaden spades and stir up an impenetrable cloud, which screams their obscure operations from your sight. Everything about this paragraph is artfully constructed and could be analyzed even at the level of the syllable. What I'm interested in, though, is the phrase, grow like wheat. We have a paradox. Ashes, of course, are what comes after death, but they also can act as a fertilizer, but here they are the actual thing growing. It is almost a cemetery-like mortuary of a garden. Something else that is important to note here is how close we are to death, right? We have ghastly, desolate, grotesque even, invisible and obscure, impenetrable, right? Things that lack life. And why this stands out is because there is one figure in the Valley of the Ashes that is full of life, and that's Myrtle. But before we meet Myrtle, we meet her husband, George. And in doing this, we also see part of Nick's romantic imagination. The interior was unprosperous and bare. The only car visible was the dust-covered wreck of a Ford, which crouched in a dim corner. It had occurred to me that this shadow of a garage must be a blind, and that sumptuous and romantic apartments were concealed overhead. When the proprietor himself appeared in the door of the office, wiping his hands on a piece of waste, he was a blond, spiritless man, anemic and faintly handsome. When he saw us, a damp gleam of hope sprang into his light blue eyes. So here, the sentence that I'm interested in is how Nick imagines that this place is a blind, that is a front for a site of assignations, of sexual assignations, sumptuous and romantic. So he's looking at this garage and he's like, it is so ugly that it has to actually cover for sexually illicit engagements. And we also notices this man, right, giving him a little bit of faint handsomeness, unlike, in terms of the attractiveness, qualities that he finds in Myrtle. So later on the same page, then I heard footsteps on a stair, and in a moment, the thickish figure of a woman blocked out the light from the office door. She was in the mid-30s and faintly stout, but she carried her surplus flesh sensuously, as some women can. Her face, above a spotted dress of dark blue crêpe de chine, contained no facet or gleam of beauty. But there was an immediately perceptible vitality about her, as if the nerves of her body were continually smoldering. She smiled slowly, and walking through her husband as if he were a ghost, shook hands with Tom, looking him flush in the eye. Then she wet her lips, and without turning around, spoke to her husband in a soft, coarse voice. So here we open with Myrtle being thick, blocking out the light. So we links us back to the darkness ideas of the opening of the Valley of Ashes, but she carries with her a vitality that is immediately perceptible, something that you can see. It's also in the language itself that she carries excess, right? Surplus, flesh, sensuously. Look at all of those S's, that's sibilance. But Nick has no patience with her face, right? No facet or gleam of beauty. The focus is on the life of her body. And she's so full of life that other things around her have withdrawn into themselves. Her husband then becomes a ghost. And we see her full flirtation with Tom when she looks at him in the eyes, smiles slowly, and then licks her lips where her husband cannot see because he's behind her, and only Tom can, and we and Nick. And lastly, her nerves are smoldering, right? Smoldering, burning slowly and hot. More ways in which she herself is like the valley. Then they go to New York. She changes into her second outfit of 3 in this chapter. And this is a brown dress. And you'll see here, she had changed her dress to a brown figured muslin, which stretched tight over her rather wide hips as Tom helped her to the platform in New York. So here her dress is being described as over her hips, which is euphemistic for her butt. We have a focus on Myrtle's body. Fascinatingly, and I think not at all by an accident, we also have somebody else in brown in this chapter and on this page, which is the dog. So this is the seller. He passed his hand over the brown wash rag of a back. Look at that coat, some coat, right? Playing on the word coat here to be something that you can put on, right? So there's 2 things that we now have that are in brown, Myrtle and the dog. And I'll come back to this point later on. Once the party's begun, we start seeing a little bit of discretion on Nick's part. Sorry, the first stage of the party, which is just Myrtle, Tom, and Nick. They ask him to go get cigarettes. Sitting on Tom's lap, Mrs. Wilson called up several people on the telephone. Then there were no cigarettes, and I went out to buy some at the drugstore on the corner. When I came back, they had disappeared. So I sat down discreetly in the living room and read a chapter of Simon Called Peter. Either there was terrible stuff or the whiskey distorted things, because it didn't make any sense to me. Just as Tom and Myrtle, after the first drink, Mrs. Wilson and I called each other by the first names, reappeared, company commenced to arrive at the apartment door. So Tom and Myrtle have, of course, asked Nick to leave to go get cigarettes so that they can have sex. We get this marked in Nick's use of discreet, right? He's giving them space even though he can hear what's going on. This is actually an instance where the film adaptation did a great job with that moment. So back to this idea of the brown, we get the word breed repeated twice in this chapter. So breed is a word that inherently has to do with sexual relations because you're thinking about the partners that have had sex. So even though it's not on the surface, and the whole point of this chapter is that things are not on the surface, it's the energy that lies underneath it all. Here we see at the linguistic level of that repetition of breed. So buying the dog. We backed up to an old gray man who bore an absurd resemblance to John D. Rockefeller. In a basket swung from his neck cowered a dozen very recent puppies of an indeterminate breed. So here we have a gray old man. He resembles the lifeless people at the Valley of the Ashes, even though around his neck he has all of this life, all of these dogs. They're of an indeterminate breed, right? You can't attest to their genealogy. Myrtle, later on, expostulating on her dislike of her husband, says, I married him because I thought he was a gentleman. She said finally, I thought he really knew something about breeding, but he wasn't fit to lick my shoe. So one of the things that happens in this chapter is Myrtle attempts to play at being upper class, at being old money. But what happens to her is that Tom breaks her nose as a result of this because the upper class enacts its violence physically on lower class people that try to cross over, to mix, right, to be indeterminate. So we see in this dehumanizing, animalizing of Myrtle that with this comparison of the dog, right? If you follow the tracks, you can see how it happens. Myrtle is also of an indeterminate breed in Tom's eyes. So it's kind of wrapping things up. Let's get to McKee at last. We see this with some of the descriptions and the focus Nick has on his face. He's going to use the spot of lather as an excuse to just look at him all night long. Mr. McKee was a pale, feminine man from the flat below. He had just shaved, for there was a white spot of lather on his cheekbone, and he was most respectful in his greeting to everyone in the room. He informed me that he was in the artistic game, and I gathered later that he was a photographer and had made the dim enlargement of Mrs. Wilson's mother, which hovered like an ectoplasm on the wall. His wife was shrill, languid, handsome, and horrible. So here we have him described as pale and feminine, qualities that in general, Nick is attracted to. right? You'll remember he compared Jordan Baker to a young cadet, so masculinizing her slenderness, and now he feminizes McKee's masculinity. He focuses in on that white spot of lather, which we're going to keep focused on. Another woman gets compared to an ectoplasm, right? The residue left behind after a spiritual encounter with a ghost. And so we have more ghosts inhabiting this space. And then denigrating his wife, shrill, languid, handsome, and horrible, using that alliteration at the end to perhaps point to a paradox, an oxymoron even. Later, though, we have this bit. After McKee has fallen asleep, Nick sees him and, quote, taking out my handkerchief, I wiped from his cheek the remains of the spot of dried lather that had worried me all the afternoon. All the afternoon, Nick has been looking at McKee. So now things start ramping up and moving more quickly toward the end. Mr. McKee leaves. Then Mr. McKee turned and continued on out the door. Taking my hat from the chandelier, I followed. Come to lunch someday, he suggested as we groaned down in the elevator. Where? Anywhere. Keep your hands off the lever, snapped the elevator boy. I beg your pardon, said Mr. McKee with dignity. I didn't know I was touching it. So here what we have is a metaphor or some phallic imagery, right? The lever, here you can see what a lever would have looked like in a 1920s elevator that Mr. McKee is holding, this phallic object. The two of them are in an elevator. We groaned down in the elevator, right? So it applies, yes, to the elevator making the sound, but also to these two men that I would argue are fooling around in the elevator. The elevator boy asks them to stop because they're getting close to the lever. Mr. McKee is like, oh, I didn't even know I was touching it, right? A little bit of further idea. We don't need the language of touch and hands on levers, but we have it. All of this commences with the most dramatic page turn and punctuation in this particular edition of Gatsby. We have an ellipsis. After he says, all right, I agreed, I'll be glad to, page turn, ellipsis. I was standing beside his bed, and he was sitting up between the sheets, clad in his underwear, with a great portfolio in his hands. So an ellipsis, those three dots, they mark gaps, holes, suppressions. Something has been left out. And here we move from them in the elevator to being in his bed. McKee is undressed. Nick is stumbling around. He's drunk. And we have one last piece of evidence that we can kind of point to this question, which comes from the manuscript. So here in the manuscript, we see, all right, I said, I'll be glad to, agreement. No ellipsis, but Fitzgerald wrote, I was sitting beside his bed and he sat between the sheets with a great portfolio in his hands. Fitzgerald went through two different ideas. He first thought he would put, he sat undressed, but then he crossed undressed out and made it in his underwear. So originally, McKee was wearing a little less clothing. And he also changed standing to sitting. So with these things in mind, I want to suggest that you also can think if this is enough evidence for you. However, I think that, yes, Mr. McKee and Nick Carraway have sex in chapter 2 of F. Scott Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby.